here we are in a home kitchen with the hopes that you will start baking at home, and with some knowledge from all the years of building up a bakery, first in our garage, now multiple locations across town, with the foundation of what we do being right in front of us here in the form of a sourdough starter. Yet what's different than normal is the idea of having 6 jars in front of me with starter at all different ranges. And so the purpose of this particular segment today is to really dive in deep into each of these starters, tell their story of where they are on their own life cycle and growth curve, and compare and contrast their use in bread, with the hopes that you at home can feed and keep a starter and make the best choices on whether you should feed it, maintain it, feed it multiple times. What should you do with that starter in order to get the right results for bread? So let's dive right in first with this jar. I labeled it 0 on top, and this jar, which you can tell has sourdough starter, which has now fallen below the rubber band. My rubber band is actually placed at the level that the starter was when it was first put into the jar. 250 grams worth, which I've realized is a little bit too much for these particular jars. I'll tell you the story of why some of them are overflowing, starting with this one. It's a really good place to start. This is a starter that I pulled from the Proof Mesa bakery, and it was last refreshed 3 days ago during the day, and it was refrigerated shortly after refresh, usually several hours after. We refreshed it in a larger batch, 10 kilograms or 10,000 grams, whereas this is just 250 grams. And when working in such a large batch, we would keep it at ambient temperature for 3 to 5 hours and then place it in the fridge in the hopes that we would trap the sourdough starter at sort of peak fermentation levels and leave it there suspended at the lower temperature. You should know that at room temperature, or more accurately, at 84 degrees Fahrenheit, starter will move very optimally between the lactobacillus and the yeast that's in a sourdough starter. Backing up, what do you mean yeast in a sourdough starter? Well, sourdough starter has 2 microbes, wild yeast in very low concentrations versus what you think of as baker's yeast, and lactobacillus, and they form a symbiotic colony to make a sourdough starter. So anyway, this one is 3 days old, and when I first stowed it yesterday, I filled this up to 250 grams, and more or less it occupied the same amount of volume as the other starter that I fed at the same time after feeding. So 250 grams of starter looked like 250 grams of refreshed flour, water, and starter in this first jar. That meant that the volume was still expanded because of that refrigerated state. It was essentially trapped at that level. And I could have baked with it. The reason I know that I could have baked with it is you can see what happened after the feeding, after rather no feeding. So I took it out of the bucket and I put it in this jar, and I had filled up 250 grams like all of my other jars, and then let it sit overnight. And what's sort of interesting is that before it contracted to below this line, it actually had exploded. So that means that the team at the Mesa Bakery is currently refrigerating starters at such a level where they still have some growth to do before falling on their face. And so if you think about a sourdough starter, it follows a particular growth cycle. First, it sort of climbs exponentially as the cell colony multiplies. So the microbes within the sourdough starter split and multiply at an exponential rate until that sourdough starter reaches a point of stasis where basically now cell multiplication is no longer happening, yet there's still enough food to be consumed that the colony is sustained at that kind of peak level. And then eventually the colony does begin to die off as the food source runs out. So this sourdough starter, which has now been fed 3 days prior and has been taken out of its refrigerated position, and now it's been ambient for 16 hours. Well, in that 16-hour process, it expanded some more, overflowed, and then retracted. And now it is halfway below the original level where it was when I put it in the container. It smells kind of like bananas at this stage. It no longer has really the acidity or the brightness. It has a bit of a foamy quality. You can still see some bubbles and some life. If you find your sourdough starter at this particular level, I wouldn't recommend baking with it anymore. In fact, I would recommend feeding it at least once and considering to feed it twice prior to baking with it. And I will prove that as we go through the jars and I show you starter at different stages. Let's give it a taste and see what it's like. Interestingly, on the taste side, it's more sour than the typical sourdough starter that is ready to use. And so though it doesn't have the smell of acidity, all of that acidic acid that's been building up is now in the sourdough starter itself, and it tastes of it. It's no longer the same tartness that you want. And I, again, would say that it's too tart to bake with. So I would definitely recommend feeding this starter if you were to have it at this stage. Some important notes. You can avoid this stage by refrigerating your starter at the right interval after feeding. If you're using a smaller jar like this, or even a larger jar like this one, which is roughly 3 times the size, I'd say it would be appropriate to put your starter in the fridge after about 5 to 6 hours after feeding. That's assuming that you're feeding your sourdough starter with a strong white bread flour. I also have a difference here in a whole grain flour, and we'll go over that shortly. But assuming you're using a strong white bread flour, then after about 6 hours you want to take this jar from ambient temperature and refrigerate it. And my guess is that you'll trap the sourdough starter at its peak levels. This is assuming a standard refresh routine of 1 part starter to 2 parts water and 2 parts flour. We will also contrast different refresh rhythms and see what happens. So that's the first jar. Let's move on. My second jar is one that I fed 16 hours ago. So it's actually still above my line, but I can tell that it's past its peak. So my line is the volume that it represented degassed when it was just put together or fed. And So in the process of stirring, I've gotten rid of all the air in the room, and now it's just the 50 grams of starter and the 100 grams of flour and the 100 grams of water. That's the rubber band. You can see that in this jar, the starter is just above the rubber band. But at one point, it was near the top of the jar. I can see the peak line here, and it appears from my looking down upon the jar, it looks like it kind of crested at the rim here. So that shows you what happens when you feed a sourdough starter and leave it out for 16 hours. It goes up and then down, and it went up basically double of where it started. It didn't explode out of the jar. Now, what's interesting and super informative to the home baker, the next one had one feeding in between. It's 8 hours old versus 16 hours old. So the 16-hour-old starter is still above the line, but if you look at it from the side visually, you can tell that the air bubbles are quite small. They're pinpoint small at this point. It looks like a richer foam versus the multi-day-old starter on my left. Yet it still has life, and that life is still allowing it to exceed the baseline level. Would I bake with it? Yes, but my results would be compromised. Thus, in a pinch, if I'm just baking for my home, for my family, maybe I'm going to lower my expectation of the resulting crumb or the strength of the rise in the bread that I'm trying to make. But if I'm just making an everyday sourdough item, probably not a sourdough croissant, I'm talking about just the standard kind of country sourdough, there's still enough strength here, and the sourdough starter is hungry enough that it will definitely react to the feeding that it receives when you mix your dough, and it will be active. But you're not getting the most out of your sourdough starter if you're baking with this particular jar. A lot of people reach out to us regularly and are trying to figure out, what is this rhythm that I should take on if I'm a home baker with my sourdough starter? Because likely the jar that I have is living in the fridge. A lot of people have read or have been told that basically you feed your sourdough starter, you put it in the refrigerator, then you take it out and you immediately get to work making bread. Well, as you can see, the starter that's been sitting around for a while, this one, your starter will reach this point in the fridge too. Our refrigerators at the bakery are quite cold, and the starter was stored at the right time to where there was enough energy left over that 2 days later, when I removed it from the fridge, there was still energy in the sourdough starter. So if you're storing your sourdough starter for a matter of a day or two, maybe it still has life in it. You can measure that by simply using a rubber band and getting a visual representation of where your starter is on its journey by whether it's above the rubber band or below. You can also see how large are the air pockets when I look at it visually. And that all gives you a clue as to where you are in that life cycle. Taste is the next measure. Well, what's interesting is if I feed the sourdough starter one time out of the fridge, I get doubling of growth. But if I feed it twice, I get an explosion at the exact same volume. So these two containers have the same amount of volume of sourdough starter, and at this one's peak, it only crested at the rim. But this one next door was fed after another 8 hours, again with the same routines. Again, only 250 grams of total content, And by the time it reached its peak, which was not very long ago, arguably it's in its top peak right now, 8 hours after feeding, it literally exploded out of this jar, letting me know that 250 grams is too much for these jars. Anyway, let's go ahead and taste the second one. I'm going to use a new spoon so that I don't conflict the taste. Again, because this one's already on its breakdown process, it's starting to smell less sharp and more kind of like bananas. And the taste, while more pleasant than the first, is still sharp and acidic. Let's move on to that third one. Now, this one I'm expecting would be optimal for me to use in a bake. As I open it, I notice that the starter is near the top of the jar, and not too long ago it was exploding out of the jar. Yet it's the same exact amount of starter by weight as the other one, minus whatever is no longer in the jar because it exploded. But you can see this jar weighs 475. This jar weighs 462, so I lost 13 grams of content from the inside of the jar that exploded out and is no longer here. And yet the two jars, you can see, one has way more volume and it actually has 13 grams less contents inside. You can immediately see visually that the air pockets in this starter from the side and from the top are significantly larger. They are no longer just pin pricks. It's almost like you could take a group of pins and stick them into those gaps. From a smell perspective, it's still quite mild in smell, but has a bit more sharpness and tartness in the smell. And yet from a taste perspective, it is more mild with just a hint of tart kind of at the end of a tasting note. That is what I'm looking for to bake with. That hint of tartness at the end of the taste that is kind of a telltale sign of a mature starter. So I got this one by refreshing the original one that I pulled from the bakery twice in 8-hour successions and leaving it at ambient temperature. If I bake with this jar now, even though I've invested 10 minutes of time refreshing it the first time and then refreshing it a second time, I will get far better performance out of this sourdough starter than I do if I were to use the first one. And the reason being is there's a greater concentration of microbes in this sourdough starter. The cell colony is larger. So now as I'm feeding it in the final dough, I'm starting from a much larger baseline overall. Now these microbes will start to consume the nutrients available, the food available in the final dough, and they'll continue to expand. So it's really kind of a build-up of a cell colony. So if you refrigerate your starter, the long and short of what we're trying to say here is it makes sense to do multiple feedings if you can before baking with it. The absolute best way of keeping your sourdough starter is to feed it regularly, daily, twice a day even, and perhaps refrigerate it at that peak level in between. That's what we do at the bakeries. It's a little less practical at home, so you're likely going to be pulling starter from the fridge that needs to be built up again. And so probably the best way to go about your home bakes from a sourdough perspective is to pull out the starter the day before you really want to use it, feed it, then feed it one more time before bed, and then the next morning go after your mixes. Or if you want to go on the opposite schedule, maybe pull out your starter the night before you really want to use it, feed it before bed, feed it before you leave the house in the morning, and then use it when you come back. What if you feel like you need to kind of amp the starter up some more? There's things you can do to speed up the fermentation cycle, but also potentially give it a leg up. After long storage, something that I like to do once in a while is feed a starter with a 1-1-1 ratio, meaning equal parts flour, water, and existing sourdough starter. That's actually what I did in this jar, and it was done at the exact same time that I fed this jar. Notice the same result transpired, and that's that this starter exploded out of the jar. So it received 2 feedings. One was a 1-2-2 feeding, and the next one was that 1-1-1 feeding. And this starter actually currently is still higher up in the jar, which is sort of interesting to me, meaning it's kind of holding at that level. It tells me that this starter hasn't actually peaked yet, because something that I know from years of working with sourdough starters is that the higher the concentration of base sourdough starter when you're feeding, again, the higher that cell colony is of microbes. And so as they go to feed on their food, there's more of them, and thus the starter has a greater overall potential, but less overall food. Because here there's more food than there is existing starter. Here there's equal amounts of food to existing starter. So the microbes will digest the available nutrients faster in this jar, which means that at this stage, while I'm looking at the 2 of them, this one is further along, and thus this one has more room to grow. So let's give it a taste. It also has nice open air pockets from the side through and through. I would gladly consider baking with it. It tastes sharper than this one, but still relatively mild when compared to the older sourdough starters. A little bit more prevalent in taste than the previous one though. So when would you use a 1-1-1 refresh like this? Oftentimes I'll like to give it this kind of power refresh when I can double dip my refreshes in a single day, knowing that if I do this kind of refresh on a 1-1-1 interval, typically the maturity time is more like 5 hours. That's why I can see this one has peaked, and it's actually at this 8-hour mark, probably already starting its descent down. It's really at its stasis mode right now, and it will drop off sooner than this one does. So if we were to kind of roll the tapes forward longer, you would see that this one would drop and be below this one within the next few hours. Again, because in this 1-2-2 ratio of feeding, the existing microbes have more food in relation to microbes, and thus it will take them longer to consume all of that food, and they'll have room to grow into it. Whereas in this case, the existing microbes started at a higher threshold and had less available food, and so they consumed it more quickly and in a more concentrated way. This discussion can sort of have a lot of implications and variability. You can feed your starter on a 1-10-10 ratio, it will move a lot slower. And so what this means is that you can actually find the feeding ratio that fits your life rhythm. Maybe you like to bake in a way that allows you an extended period of time where you're not having to babysit the doughs. Maybe you leave your home kitchen for a longer period of time. Well, you could have a lower base concentration of starter versus your feeding ratio and achieve longer fermentation times. On the flip side, you could go more concentrated and speed up that cycle, while also being able to sort of manipulate the taste of your final bread based on the sourdough starter that you're using. Interestingly, also, what flour you feed matters. So let's actually bring this jar now fully into perspective. Similar to these last two jars, this one was fed with a white flour last night at the time that we fed this one. And then this morning it was fed not with the same strong white bread flour, but rather with our proof flour mill Rouge de Bordeaux sifted flour. So it's a whole grain flour, stone milled. And now it's been 8 hours, and you can see that in this case, this starter experienced a lot of growth. It did not exceed the threshold of the jar like both of its kind of cousins that were fed at the same interval, but it did grow, and it's already retracting down. You can see that the peak was actually here, and now it's, I don't know, a half an inch below where it peaked out at. There's some important notes here, something that you can learn from. If you feed your starter a whole wheat or a whole grain flour, meaning it has a lot of bran and germ versus a white flour, those extra nutrients that are found in the bran are like a supercharged food for your starter. Your starter consumes them more easily, actually, than consuming the more starchy white flour, and consumes them faster. So the actual fermentation cycle on a whole grain, whole wheat starter is faster and more pronounced than on a white sourdough starter. Thus, 8 hours after feeding, I'm already past peak. If I wanted to use this as like a final levain in a bread to get a whole grain or whole wheat sourdough starter, likely my aim would be to create a more tart final sourdough due to the fermentation properties of whole grain and whole wheat flour. But also I would want to feed and then mix my final doughs within usually 3 to 5 hours of feeding a whole grain starter. So in this case, I would already be behind the curve for mixing. And what's sort of interesting is the resulting bread from this particular starter is going to have a sharper flavor. Whole grain and whole wheat starters have heterofermentive properties versus white flours have homofermentive properties. The two differ from each other in taste at the end, where homofermentive sourdough starters are milkier, creamier, and more subtle, and heterofermentive starters are sharper and more acidic. So by smell, it smells actually quite neutral and doesn't actually invoke as much sharpness as this one, but by taste, wow, it compares in taste closer to the first two that have been hanging around for a longer period, 16 hours for this one. So keep in mind that all three of these jars were fed at the exact same time. So it's sort of an interesting thing to reflect on in knowing that if you use a whole grain or whole wheat flour, you should A, mix sooner after feeding, and if you maintain your starter with a whole wheat or whole grain flour, it would mean that you need to refrigerate it sooner, or you need to feed it more frequently, maybe more than twice a day if you're keeping it ambient, but also your resulting bread will be significantly sharper. So let's move on to the final jar, and that is the jar of starter that is young in nature. So this starter here has been fed from baseline for the first time, and it is only 4 hours old at this stage. So it has a completely different smell to it. It's kind of hard to describe the smell. I don't have a sense of sharpness at all. Maybe I would equate it to kind of the smell of milk. I see pinprick bubbles, which means it kind of looks a lot like these first jars, but volumetrically you can see that it's a lot taller. The starter itself is already kind of at the top of the jar. This would be, without a doubt, the characteristic young sourdough starter that actually in modern times is very popular to bake with, in the sense that this starter will yield very mild final results if you bake with it. However, you might still be missing some of the maximal expression from the microbes inside. Over the next couple hours, you're going to get more air pockets developing as more of the food is consumed, and a deeper flavor developing, while some of the lactobacillus microbes catch up to the growth of the wild yeast. And that yeast will still be expanding. Maybe this one will even have a tendency of overflowing over the next couple hours. For me, as a baker, this starter is significantly too young for me to use. I would use it before I use these first two older ones, but I would rather wait till it reaches levels more similar to these jars before using it. Will it yield bread that rises in the end? Absolutely. But have you reached kind of the peak cell colony that you can achieve before reintroducing food? I don't think so. So that's kind of those are some thoughts on this young starter. It is still quite strong as a dough. And in taste, it is starting to develop that backline acidity that I'm looking for. So even in its journey, by taste, I can tell that it's more than halfway to its peak. It will first get volume and not have a whole lot of flavor profile, still be very mild. If it tastes more like the ingredients you put in, meaning flour, well, it's clearly not ready. You're definitely looking for that tartness before it's ready for use. And so after going through that kind of the full assessment, visual, smell, and taste, I would say it's better than I thought, but still not in an ideal place. Whereas this one and this one are definitely at that stasis that I like to personally mix my doughs in. So that gives you a bit of a summary of how to measure sourdough starter at its various stages, and kind of an idea of go or no go on baking. And so I would say no go on baking. I would say only in an emergency go 16 hours later. I would say definitely you can go. I would say still okay, but probably should have happened a couple hours ago. I'd say not quite there yet, but well on its way. That's a summary of the various stages of sourdough starter, and hopefully you can reference some of these same features as you're taking your starter out and trying to figure out where it is in its life cycle. I think it's all about trying to figure out where are you on that curve with your sourdough starter, and that should inform your decision of, do I feed it or do I bake with it? And both can be valid responses. It's easiest to score your loaves when they're cold. We eat with our eyes first.
You have to understand your audience enough to be able to say, like, I'm going to be charging a lot of money for my super crazy cool thing, or it's so cool and so creative that only you can do it, and then you don't stand a chance of scaling it.
Let's go over what it's like to build a bakery from one person to many.